not just an additional piece of information that is going to burden me. Let me tell you just a little bit about myself. I am, as Tim told you, I am an attorney. I'm also an ordained elder. That alone is worth the price of admission for today. That would be kind of like seeing the bearded lady at the circus or something like that. I am the freak show. I'm the ordained lawyer. I do this work as general counsel throughout the week, and then on the weekends I have additional ministry as doing interim pastor work. In fact, tonight is my first board meeting with the new church that I was just assigned to. So I enjoy that. Being a pastor allows me at least one opportunity every week to tell people something that they want to hear, which is not how I spend most of my week. Before I came to work here for the church 20 years ago, I was a prosecutor. And that will probably come across in the way that I present some of this information. I am still a prosecutor at heart, which means essentially I think that everybody is guilty. And well, not really, but that's, I do have a different view of life, probably because of my experience. I brought that over here to the church. I've been working for the church for, here at headquarters, Global Ministry Center, for 20 years. I've been in this role as general counsel for 10 years. That is a little bit about me. By way of a preface to this, let me say that although I went to law school in Indiana, I am not licensed in Indiana. So you may have occasion to have to speak with me from time to time, but I need you to understand that whatever I say does not take the place of qualified legal counsel from somebody who is licensed to practice within your state. When I talk to you, if I have to talk to you, it's going to be about what the church law is, what church practices are, and possibly precedent of how others have dealt with these types of situations. I should also tell you that I deal with a lot of situations, and I have a rule that I never share an example, an illustration, unless I have had that happen at least twice. So if you hear me talk about a scenario and you think you know the situation I'm talking about, I need to tell you right up front, it's not the church you're thinking of, it's another one. All right, so with that out of the way, I want to talk to you today about how you can stay out of legal trouble. Now, I've been doing these presentations for 10 years now. And up until a couple of years ago, the way that I would do this would be to share basically the trending legal issues, the number one reasons why churches have been getting into trouble, why pastors are spending their time in court. And there's going to be an element of that in this presentation today. But there was always something unsatisfying about that. It seemed like we were always addressing issues after they happened. And I wasn't able to give a lot of guidance about how to avoid the problems. And so I started taking a look at this. I looked at the hundreds and hundreds of cases that I've handled. And although every one of them is different, every fact pattern is different, when I went back and I started to analyze at what point did the train start to go off of the tracks, I discovered there weren't a whole bunch of reasons why. There were just a few. And that allowed me to begin to develop what I first considered to be guidelines. I then came up with suggestions about how to stay out of legal trouble. But as the years have passed, I have become more and more convinced about these principles. And so I rescind any reference to any of these as being suggestions or guidelines. And I'm going to tell you they are commandments. You must obey these if you want to stay out of legal trouble. Now, violation of any of them will bring punishment, but it's not going to be punishment from me, and it's not going to be punishment from the district. It's going to be punishment in the form of you having to waste all kinds of time and money and energy dealing with these problems rather than doing that which all of us thought we were going to be doing when we said yes to the call to ministry. So because of that, I want you to think of these things as commandments. And how many do we have? We have 10 commandments for staying out of legal trouble. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front, there's not really 10. There's really only about 6. But in addition to being a lawyer, I'm a preacher. And in addition to being a lawyer and a preacher, I'm a little bit OCD. And 10 commandments, that just sounds right to me for a whole bunch of reasons. So I say a couple of them in different ways. I split a couple of them up to make it into 10. But there's really only about 6. And I tell you this for a couple reasons. One is so that when you hear me say something and it sounds familiar, you don't have to flip back and think, well, wait a minute, didn't he just cover this? Yeah, guilty as charged. But the other reason I'm telling you this is so that you understand that there's not a lot of things here that you have to know. These are not complicated. You don't have to have a law degree. You don't have to know biblical Hebrew or Greek. These are pretty simple concepts. Each of you will be able to leave this session having memorized the 10 commandments for staying out of legal trouble. But I need to tell you that even though they are simple to understand, it is important that you memorize them, that you meditate upon them day and night, that you write them down and tie them around your forehead. Because if you do not have these committed to memory, I promise you that the very first time you encounter a situation where one of these is going to apply, church culture and your own instincts will be such that they will tell you to do something 180 degrees opposite of what the commandment is. And just the nature of things. You break one of these commandments, pretty soon you'll be breaking more and more. And before you know it, there's going to be a day when you come staggering into your study, just burdened down by all these problems that you're dealing with, and you're wondering, why under the sun did I ever accept this assignment? If only somebody had told me something up front to help me avoid this problem. And then, like a light bulb, you're going to remember that there was this day when you were sitting in a Zoom conference, listening to some really intense-looking lawyer who was glaring at you and droning on about 10 commandments, something or other. And you're going to look back and you're going to find these, and you're going to say, oh my goodness, I violated 5 of these in this situation alone. Well, don't be that person. So if you want to avoid having to spend your time dealing with legal problems, here they go. The 10 commandments for staying out of legal trouble. Commandment number 1 is this: the manual is your best friend. It will protect you, provided that you stay within its boundaries. If you deviate from the manual in any way, you run the risk of losing all of its protections. Now, I will admit, this is not the most compelling read that I've ever had. This drags on, basically starting at page 1, and it continues on for 410 pages. Somebody actually called us a while ago wanting to know if we were going to release an audio version of the Bible. And I had to actually issue an opinion that we shouldn't do that out of fear that people would listen to it while driving or operating heavy machinery and cause a problem. It's not exciting. And there are areas here that are seemingly contradictory. There are areas that we could definitely say better, and we try to improve it all the time. But in all of these legal problems that I've been involved in over the years, what I've discovered is that those pastors who try their best to stay within what the manual requires are the ones that emerge from these legal problems relatively unscathed. It's the ones who ignore the manual, who intentionally deviate from it, who they're the ones who don't even really know that we have a manual, that find themselves in the biggest problems. The manual protects us in a couple of different ways. One is it tells us how we do things. It has our procedures. The manual says that it is the bylaws for every local church. It means it tells us how we conduct our business. And you violate your bylaws at your own risk. Now, I could give you all kinds of examples, but let me just give you one that might hit home for you. Manual spells out how we are to have an annual meeting every year, the way in which we elect our board and our officers, the way that we conduct our board meetings and structure our board. As long as we follow that, then that offers some protections for us, so that if your church gets sued, Even if the board members and you as a pastor get sued in your personal capacity relating to a church legal matter, you probably have, I hope you have, D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance. That will cover you, and the insurance company will assign legal counsel. They will cover the cost. They will basically make sure that you emerge from that without having to sell your house in order to pay a judgment. However, every insurance company has somebody whose primary job it is to look and see if there's any reason that they don't have to pay a claim. One of the first things that they're going to do if you file a D&O claim is look and see whether you have a properly constituted church board. If you have not followed what the manual says you need to do in terms of electing your board and composing your board, you could find yourself in the situation that at least 2 of our churches have within the last couple of years, where insurance companies have looked and said, sorry, we have no coverage for you because the board that you have is not authorized by your bylaws. And so despite the fact that they've been paying premiums all these years, they had to go out and hire their own lawyers and deal with that themselves. It protects us in terms of our, it tells us how we are to hire and fire people. One of the #1 trending scenarios in which churches are finding themselves in court is over employment law disputes. And it is not from office staff, it is from pastors and associates who are suing over improper termination. Now, the manual has a process. In order to hire an associate, you need district approval. Annually, you need your board approval. If you're going to fire somebody, there's a process for that. As long as you follow that process, the courts have consistently said that they are not going to get involved and tell a church who they can and can't have as employees. But the courts have said that they expect us to follow our own rules. And if we disregard our rules, then we have no protection. So please make sure that if you have any associates, whether they're paid or not, that you have submitted a job description to the district and gotten approval annually to be able to have them. And if you've got to fire somebody, talk to your district, make sure that and talk to the board, make sure you follow the right process. The manual also protects us in terms of spelling out what our doctrine is. Now, I'm going to go into greater detail about that in the 10th commandment, but I want you to keep that in mind. The second commandment is this: you will never be the first person to deal with a particular situation. It might be the first time you've dealt with it. It might be the first time that this situation has come up in your church. But I promise you, there's nothing that you will ever encounter where you are the first one to have ever dealt with the problem. Now, I hope you hear that and take comfort from it, because as pastors, we have enough to do without having to reinvent the wheel on everything. And we are a connected church. That's one of the advantages of being a denomination. It's one of the advantages of being a part of a district. So whenever you're dealing with a situation, whether it's positive or negative, there is great advantage into reaching out to others and learning from their experiences, learning from their success and learning from their mistakes. It seems that at least once a month, I will hear from a church that thought that they had a novel idea, something that no one has ever considered before. It's brand new. It's going to revolutionize Christian ministry. They are going to create, or they have created, a coffee shop in order to reach people within the community. No one's ever thought of that before. And so they set out and they do that. And then lo and behold, they find that they have gotten in trouble with the Internal Revenue Service because of unrelated business income. They find that they've gotten in trouble with their county or their municipality because of real estate tax. They find all sorts of problems that they could have avoided if they had simply, before starting this, reached out to others and found out what their experience was. I always recommend that you keep your district superintendent informed about everything that's going on. And this is one reason why. But also reach out to other pastors. reach out to us. I'll tell you, if you ever contact me about something that I've never encountered before I spend any amount of time researching it, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to send an email to a group of denominational general counsel where we are in contact with each other every day about situations that come up. Because if it's something that we've never dealt with in the Church of the Nazarene, I promise the Episcopalians or the Roman Catholics or the Mormons, they've dealt with it. And we learn from each other's experience. So always reach out to others and learn from their mistakes. And I say the coffee shop ministry is an example. I'm not opposed to that. I've seen it work. I've also seen it spectacularly fail. I had one district call me because their coffee shop of a local church was running into some trouble. And in talking with the district, I learned that this local church had, over the past 5 years, invested $250,000 into this ministry. And the purpose of the ministry was to be able to reach people in the community who otherwise would not be attending the church. Now, they had all kinds of legal problems, but as we're talking through them, I said to the district administrator, I said, I'm curious, how many people have come to know Jesus through this ministry? And he said, well, that's interesting. I asked the same question, and the answer is none that we know of. Not one. Now, that tells you a lot right there. If with $250,000, they could have hired a whole team of people to do nothing more than door-to-door evangelism, and I guarantee they would have gotten at least one salvation. Now, like I said, I've seen coffee shop ministries work, but here's the deal. If you have an idea of creating a coffee shop ministry, and your model is going to be exactly the same as this other one, you can expect to have the exact same results. So learn from each other's successes, learn from each other's failures. And if you're going to do something, take a look at what it was that made that particular ministry unsuccessful and do something different, but don't mimic it. So that's the second commandment. The third one is this. You will always, every single time, you will always be surprised when you receive a report of misconduct involving someone whom you trust. So you must never base your initial reaction on whether you personally believe the accusations. I don't know whether it's a trait of those of us in pastoral ministry or whether it's part of the human condition. But I think that we have a tendency to believe that we're all good judges of character and that we can spot where the problems are within our churches. So if I were to tell you right now, I want you to imagine that there is somebody within your church right now who is plotting to steal up to $100,000 from you. Can you imagine who that might be or what that person might be? Now, I'll remind you what Pastor Tim said at the beginning. We're recording this, so please don't offer any names or anything like that. I just want you to hold that thought in your mind. Who is it that could be stealing up to $100,000 from your church? Now, let me give you the profile, because this is the typical person who steals up to $100,000 from the Church of the Nazarene. She is a woman, 43 years old. She has been the treasurer, church administrator, or has worked in the office for at least 5 years, and her pastor says, I would trust her with anything. Now, if we change the dollar amount to $100,000 or more, who is that? Well, the profile is the same, except it now is a man. It's a man, 43 years old. He's been the treasurer, church administrator, has worked in the office for at least 5 years. His pastor says, I would trust him with anything. This year, I actually have to modify that second one a little bit. There is another person who is most likely to steal over $100,000. It is a pastor who has direct access to the finances of the church in violation of the manual. Unfortunately, that one trended up this year. Now, if that profile of who's likely to steal, if that surprises you, I want you to think about it. Because when I asked you who it is that's most likely to steal from you, if you had a thought of somebody who looks really shady, suspicious, shifty, if you had a thought about somebody who maybe has a history of theft or dishonesty, Well, my guess is you wouldn't let that person within 100 yards of your checkbook. You wouldn't let that person touch any of your money. In order for somebody to get to the point where they can steal from you, they first have to have convinced you that they are trustworthy to be able to handle your money. Same way with our children. If I were to ask you, who is it that is most likely to commit sexual misconduct against one of the children of your church? If you're thinking that it's the shady character who drives around in a van without any windows in the back, it's the guy in a trench coat who's dangling Beanie Babies out the window trying to lure kids in, it's not that. Because if you had the slightest hint that there was a person who was a danger to your kids, I'm confident you wouldn't let them anywhere near your children, would you? In order for someone to be able to harm our children, they first have to have convinced you that they are trustworthy, helpful, and kind. And so by definition, every single time somebody abuses the children or steals your money or does anything involving misconduct, you're going to be shocked. You're going to be surprised, and you're not going to want to believe it. So I'm telling you now, don't base your initial reaction on whether you personally believe it. Your initial reaction is spelled out what you need to do within the manual and in some things that we're going to get to in a moment. You will typically get a report about somebody whom you trust. And very rarely is it going to be something that's just as clear as a bell. Very rarely are you going to have somebody who's caught with the offering stuffed in their pockets trying to sneak out of the church. Very rarely are you going to have somebody who is caught in the very act of abusing a child. It's almost always going to be in a situation where there's going to be some gray area, some questions, some ambiguities, and your instincts, because it's somebody whom you trust, it's somebody whom you know, your instincts are going to be to try to explain it away and say, well, they were probably just being stupid. They were probably just exercising poor judgment. So that brings me to commandment number 4. Stupidity and bad judgment are the same as conduct unbecoming. Now let me qualify that. Any of us can be guilty of bad judgment or stupidity from time to time. In fact, if you watch me for the rest of this day, I'm confident you'll be able to point out some stupid things and some errors of judgment that I exercise. I'm not saying that every act of stupidity or every act of poor judgment requires coming in with nuclear force, pulling a credential, expelling someone from membership. But I am saying that every act of stupidity and misconduct requires some kind of response. Think about the times in your life, particularly when you were young, where you did something that you wouldn't do today. And the reason you wouldn't do it today is because you had somebody come alongside you and correct you lovingly, but firmly, saying, don't do that again. Stupidity and bad judgment are not excuses for those of us in ministry. In fact, the manual makes it very, very clear that we are to be examples to the rest of the church about purity, about punctuality, about prayer, that all of those things. And so I don't know how many times I've had a pastor or a district superintendent call me up and explain an allegation about somebody. And they say, well, you know, I'm not entirely, I really doubt that this person's a pedophile. I really doubt that this person set out to steal. I think they're just being stupid. I think they're just exercising bad judgment. And what I've come to respond with is this: I don't care. I don't care whether the person is a pedophile or the person is just stupid. Either way, do you really want to entrust our children with them? Would you really want to put on the sign in front of your church, come to our church, we have a youth pastor who is an idiot? That's not the way that we want to respond to the community. So let's not excuse those things. the types of situations I deal with, the child abuse, the affairs, the embezzlements, the child pornography. There's not a one of them where the individual just woke up one day and said, today is the day that I'm going to abandon everything in my faith. Today is the day I'm going to throw it all away, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to cause irreparable harm to the Church of Jesus Christ. In every single situation, it started off with some stupidity and some bad judgment that could have been nipped in the bud by somebody coming alongside and taking some action. But it didn't happen for one reason or another, and then it got to the point where the consequences were just horrible. So please remember that, whether you're dealing with a lay person, or whether you're dealing with clergy. You're looking for a definition of conduct unbecoming, it's stupidity and bad judgment. Commandment number 5, never let your leader or your successor be surprised. The second commandment was to always reach out to others, because you're never going to be the first one dealing with this situation. This is somewhat related. Don't ever let, senior pastors, don't ever let your district superintendent be surprised by anything that's going on. That's good news and bad news. Let me just emphasize the good news part, because I know enough about the job of district superintendent that it's very rare and it's very welcome to get a call about something good that's going on. That would be a blessing to him. But also let him be aware of the things that are going on that you don't necessarily need him to do anything about. You just want him to be aware of it, because 1, he'll be able to give you counsel. And number 2, it protects you, because you don't want to have to venture out and deal with these things on your own. And the mere fact that you have told somebody else about it is going to protect you so much. But I also want you to make sure that you don't let your successor be surprised. I want you to think back to the first 2 to 4 months that you were in your current assignment. Were there things that you learned about that you really wish somebody had told you about in advance? Maybe you had somebody who had been under discipline, but nobody bothered to document it and let you know. Or maybe there was a pending problem with a office copier lease or something like that. What are you going to do now to make sure that whoever takes your place knows what they need to know in order to be successful? Start writing some stuff down now and start making a file. Things my successor needs to know. And you can just leave it on the desk, I guess, on your last day. But do what you can to make sure that whoever comes in after you isn't blindsided by any of the problems you face. I hope all of you are doing background checks for anybody who's involved with children. I'd like you to be doing background checks on everybody who's doing any kind of ministry. What steps have you taken to make sure that your successor is aware of anybody who is disqualified because of something that showed up in the background check or is disqualified because of their conduct? The next 2 commandments deal largely with the same issue. And it's not because I'm splitting them up in order to get to 10 commandments. This has 2 commandments because this is so important. This is the number 1 reason, and has been for as long as I've been in this job. This is the number 1 reason why churches end up in court, is sexual misconduct against minors. Commandment number 6, you must always and immediately report to the proper authorities any reasonable suspicion that a child has been sexually abused. Let me break that down a little bit. It starts off with the word you. Every state has different laws about who is a mandatory reporter. In the Church of the Nazarene, we have made this very easy. You are a mandatory reporter. Every Sunday school teacher, every worship leader, every janitor, every person who has any responsibility whatsoever within the church, whether they're paid or unpaid, credentialed or lay, everyone is a mandatory reporter. If you have any, if you hear of any reasonable suspicion that a child has been abused, it's your responsibility to either report that or to make sure it has been reported. So if somebody comes to you and talks to you about it, you can ask, have you hotlined this? And if it has not been hotlined, you either need to watch while they do it, or you pick up the phone and you do it yourself. If you call me on one of these situations, if it's about sexual misconduct involving a minor, the first question I'm going to ask you is, have you hotlined it? The second question is going to be, have you talked to your district superintendent? This is so important. You must do it. It is your responsibility, and you must immediately do it. What does immediately mean? It means right now. Here's the delay that I will allow you. I'll allow you time to fulfill commandment number 2, which is that you're never the first one to deal with the situation, so you should always reach out to others. I'll allow you time enough to reach out, senior pastor, to call your district superintendent. But if your DS doesn't immediately pick up the phone, you hang up and you hotline it. Tim, if you hear about a situation and you want to reach out to me or to Gary Hartke or something, that's fine. But if we don't immediately pick up, you hang up and hotline it. It's got to happen right away. There was a church down in Texas not too long ago where a girl reported or told her Sunday school teacher that a stepfather had abused her. Now, it's not connected with the church whatsoever. It didn't happen at the church. It wasn't done by anybody at the church. It was done by the stepfather, but the Sunday school teacher heard about it. Sunday school teacher went immediately to the youth pastor, told him. They both went to the senior pastor, talked to him. They conferred about it, and a few days later decided, yes, we need to report this. And they got some free publicity because their mugshots were in the newspaper because they were indicted for failure to report in a timely manner. The primary lawsuits that I have had to deal with in this role have not been because of misconduct that has occurred within our churches. It has been for failure to report in a timely manner. So it has to happen right away. You have to report to the proper authorities. Who are the proper authorities? You can report to local law enforcement if you want, or you can report it to the state hotline. My recommendation almost always is going to be to call the hotline. And that's because the scenarios that you're going to hear about very rarely will be clear black and white ones. It's not going to be a matter of somebody saying, I was just raped in the parking lot. It's going to be somebody telling you about a situation that occurred 20 years in the past. It's going to be a situation where you have a 18-year-old boyfriend and a 17-year-old girlfriend. It's going to be the ones that are just, you don't really know what to do with it. If you call the hotline, they deal with these things all the time. They're not going to overreact and they're not going to ignore it. Whereas, especially if you're in a smaller community, if you report it to local law enforcement, they may not know what to do with it. They may overreact, they may underreact. So I recommend you call the hotline. You are to report to the proper authorities any reasonable suspicion. What's a reasonable suspicion? It's what an ordinary, prudent person would think. You are not required to find proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, you're not required to investigate whatsoever at this stage. The question is, if this is true, what I have just heard, should somebody do something about it? I've gotten hundreds of calls about this. I think 3 times perhaps have I said, no, you don't have to report this. Almost always. If it rises to the point where you're concerned about it, it needs to get reported. It is, please remember, it's not up to you to investigate it at this stage. It's up to you to report it. Don't make the mistake of asking permission first person can't give you permission or absolve you from the requirement. You are required. You must report it. I understand the desire to sometimes want to talk to the parties first and let them know that you're going to do it. Please don't, because far too often the parties are going to say, well, we don't really want to make it that sort of a deal. We don't want it to rise to that level. And then you're going to be in an awful situation because you're still obligated to report it. You have to do it. So if you need to follow up with folks afterwards, do it. But your first responsibility is to report it. Commandment number 7. No person who has committed the offense of sexual misconduct against a child may ever be in any position of leadership or service or anything within the Church of the Nazarene. Let me just answer some questions in advance about this. They may not be on the worship team. They can't be in the sound booth. They may not be the janitor. They cannot do grounds work. The Board of General Superintendents has said such individuals may serve as parishioners only, with no other responsibility within the local church. Now, if there's any of these that I get pushback on or a reaction, it is this. And when I wear my pastor's hat, I understand where folks are coming from. And usually the reaction that I get is, well, are we saying that this is an unforgivable sin? Are we saying we don't believe in redemption? Are we saying that Jesus does not have the ability to save and to forgive and to transform? No, not at all. We absolutely believe in the ability of Jesus to change, to save, to purify. But this is not about redemption. This is not about salvation. This is about service within the church. Let me just, well, I'll save this example for the next one. But let me tell you this. I understand very much the desire to try to find a path of redemption, a place for somebody to be able to serve. And I will tell you that a person who has committed sexual misconduct against a child can have a powerful, wonderful ministry as a prayer warrior. That is something that would be permissible. But I have never had a pastor get mad at me, yell at me, or resist over the notion that somebody who has been convicted of theft should not be the church treasurer. That's never been a problem. I've never had an issue with telling a pastor that somebody who has a history of aggravated battery or anything like that they should have some safeguards put around them and should not be just allowed to do anything they want within the church. But on this particular issue, there's something there, something that causes the most passionate of reactions. And I saw this as a prosecutor. In all the years of dealing with it, this is one where there's something going on and it goes beyond the human level. I just would throw this out to you. I've never asked it this way before in a setting like this. But if you're having some resistance to what I'm saying right now, and if there's somebody in particular in mind that you have, and you're thinking, well, this person needs to be able to serve within the church, can I just ask you, is everybody within your church serving? Is everybody within your church doing an active ministry? And if not, what makes this person so different? Is it because you really feel that everybody needs to be involved in a ministry, or is it because this person wants to be? This person is pushing, this person wants to be plugged in some way. There's something here where it just does not make sense to me at the human level. And I understand that we want to be a church that believes in grace, and we are a church that wants to believe in love. But let me remind you what the third commandment was, that you're always going to be surprised. I can tell you that every single abuse case that I've handled, every one of them. The pastor was shocked because the pastor was absolutely convinced this person was safe. And since the COVID lockdown, every single case of abuse that I have handled has been someone who has violated this commandment. They already had a prior, and the church knew about it. And the pastor believed that they could be trusted, and they put that person in a place of ministry, and the child was hurt. Please, we can be a church of love and a church of grace. But that leads me to the 8th commandment, and that is that extending grace and love must not equate to enabling. Suppose for a moment that I have a ministry in your church of driving the van or the church bus on Sunday. I drive around, I pick up people who don't have transportation, and I bring them to the church. And then something happens. It's entirely outside of my control. I didn't invite it, but either I get in an accident or I get sick or something and I lose my eyesight. I'm blind. But I come to you and I say, Pastor, I am not released from this ministry. I still want to drive the van every Sunday morning. How many of you are going to let me? Well, okay, the record holds. So far, nobody has said that they would. No, you're not going to let me. Why? Well, it's obvious. It's a liability nightmare. It's a danger to myself, to the people in my van. It's a danger to the people on the road. Wouldn't do that. Suppose I come to you and I say, Pastor, people have been praying for me for a long time, and I want to tell you the prayers have been answered. I can see again. Praise the Lord, I can see. I don't have my driver's license, but I can see. I want to start driving the van. You going to let me? So far, nobody has said that they would because I don't have a driver's license. If I said, well, I've got a note from my doctor who says I'm perfectly safe to drive, I still haven't gotten a driver's license. You're still not going to let me. Again, it's a liability nightmare. Well, let me ask you, that's a situation there where I didn't invite this affliction. I didn't do anything. This was thrust upon me. I am an innocent victim. Do you find it unloving or ungraceful to tell me that I have a ministry area that has been precluded, that I can't be a driver? Why under the sun? When we have a situation where someone who willingly, intentionally, maliciously harmed children, willingly brought those consequences upon themselves, why do we think that it's unloving and ungraceful to tell that person there are consequences to your actions, and those consequences are that you cannot serve in this role within the church? And let me also say that since I did tell you that they can serve as a prayer warrior, I don't know why we resist that so much. We need more of them. If we believe what we preach, we need as many prayer warriors as possible. Do we not believe that that is a vital, needed ministry? What's wrong with directing a person who wants to serve